Maria Santos pushed her cleaning cart across the tarmac of Peterson Air Force Base, her weathered hands gripping the handle tightly against the Colorado wind. At 62, she had been working as a civilian contractor for almost 15 years, cleaning everything from barracks to mess halls. Today, like every Tuesday and Thursday, she was assigned to the flight line where the massive military aircraft sat like sleeping giants. The other cleaning staff avoided the flight line. They said it was too intimidating, too loud, too dangerous. But Maria found peace among these machines of war. Each aircraft told a story through its scratches, dents, and wear patterns. She treated them with the same respect she once gave to the vintage cars her late husband Roberto used to restore in their garage back in Pueblo. As she approached the AC-130 gunship, several young airmen were gathered near the aircraft's nose, their voices carrying across the concrete. Maria had learned to tune out their conversations over the years. Young soldiers always had something to prove, always had jokes to share, always had someone to look down upon. "Look at the old lady with her little rag," one of them snickered, pointing in her direction. "Does she really think she can clean that monster with a spray bottle?" Another airman joined in, his voice dripping with mockery. "My grandmother could probably do a better job, and she's been dead for 10 years. Maria's face remained expressionless as she unpacked her supplies. She had heard worse over the years. When you were a Mexican-American woman working on a military base, comments about your age, your ethnicity, or your job were just part of the background noise. She had developed thick skin during her decades of service, first as an Army medic in Desert Storm, then as a mother raising 3 children alone after Roberto's death, and now as someone society deemed invisible. The gunship towered above her, its dark gray paint job scarred by countless missions. She began her work methodically, starting with the landing gear and working her way up. Her movements were precise, practiced, and filled with a reverence that the watching airmen couldn't understand. To them, she was just an old cleaning lady. To her, this aircraft was a guardian that carried heroes into battle and brought them home. Seriously, why did they even bother? The first airman continued, his voice growing louder as if he wanted Maria to hear. "It's not like polishing it is going to make it fly better. It's just busy work for people who can't do real jobs." His companion laughed, slapping him on the back. "Come on, Johnson. Leave the abuela alone. At least she's not asking us to do it." Maria's hand paused for just a moment as she heard the Spanish word for grandmother used as a slur. She thought of her own grandchildren. How proud they were when she told them about her work on the base. How they bragged to their friends that their abuela worked with fighter jets and helicopters. She thought of Roberto, who would have been furious to hear anyone speak to his wife this way. But Maria had learned long ago that dignity wasn't about fighting every battle. It was about knowing your worth regardless of whether others recognized it. She continued her work, her cloth moving in gentle circles across the aircraft's surface, each motion deliberate and caring. The gunship's metal was cold beneath her touch, but she could feel the history embedded in every rivet and panel. This wasn't just cleaning to her. This was honoring the men and women who had flown in this aircraft, who had trusted their lives to its engines and armor, who had fought to protect freedom in places whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce. As she worked around to the side of the aircraft, more airmen began to notice her presence. Word spread quickly through the small group, and soon nearly a dozen young service members had gathered to watch the entertainment. Their comments grew bolder, their laughter louder. "Hey, does anyone else think it's funny that they have a janitor cleaning a $30 million aircraft?" Someone called out. "Maybe they should give her a promotion to pilot," another voice added, causing an eruption of laughter. "I bet she'd crash it before she even got off the ground." Maria's movements never faltered, but inside, a familiar sadness settled over her heart. These young people had no idea who she was, what she had done, or what she had sacrificed. To them, she was just an old woman with a cleaning rag, someone to be dismissed and ridiculed. They saw her uniform of simple work clothes and assumed it told her entire story. She thought about her medals, locked away in a safety deposit box downtown. The Bronze Star she had earned for treating wounded soldiers under enemy fire in Kuwait. The Purple Heart from the mortar attack that had left shrapnel in her left shoulder. A constant reminder of the day she had saved 4 lives while ignoring her own injuries. The commendations from grateful commanders who had watched her work miracles with nothing but medical supplies and determination. But those medals belonged to Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, U.S. Army Medical Corps, The woman cleaning this aircraft was just Maria, the invisible contractor who showed up on time, did her job without complaint, and went home to an empty house every evening. As she moved her cloth across a particularly stubborn stain, Maria whispered a quiet prayer for the crew of this aircraft, wherever they might be. She prayed for their safety, for their families, and for their successful return from whatever mission they were currently flying. It was a ritual she had performed thousands of times, a small way of continuing her service long after her military career had ended. The mockery continued as Maria worked her way around the massive gunship, her cleaning supplies catching the afternoon sunlight. The group of airmen had grown larger, with some junior officers now joining the crowd. What had started as casual ridicule was becoming a full-blown spectacle, and Maria found herself at the center of unwanted attention. "I heard they're thinking about replacing all the mechanics with cleaning ladies," Sergeant First Class Miller announced to the group, his voice carrying the authority of his rank. "Apparently they work cheaper and complain less." The laughter that followed was harsh and cutting. Maria continued her methodical cleaning, but she could feel the weight of their stares, the pressure of their judgment. Her arthritis was acting up today, making each movement of her arms a small struggle, but she refused to show any sign of weakness or discomfort. Staff Sergeant Williams, a young woman who had recently been promoted, stepped forward with a cruel smile. "Ma'am," she called out in a voice dripping with false politeness, "are you sure you know what you're doing? That's a very expensive piece of equipment you're touching." Maria looked up briefly, meeting the young sergeant's eyes with quiet dignity. "I know what I'm doing," she replied softly, her accent thick but her English clear. "I've been doing this for many years." "Years of what? Cleaning?" William shot back, causing another wave of laughter. "Because there's a difference between mopping floors and working on military aircraft. You might want to be more careful before you damage something important." The comment stung more than Maria wanted to admit. She had spent countless hours learning about each aircraft she cleaned, studying their specifications, understanding their capabilities. She knew more about the AC-130 gunship than most of the airmen watching her. She knew it was nicknamed Puff the Magic Dragon by those who flew in it, that it could carry a crew of 13, that its firepower could level a city block with precision accuracy. But knowledge meant nothing when people had already decided what you were worth based on your appearance and job title. A young airman named Rodriguez approached the aircraft, his confidence boosted by the crowd's encouragement. "Hey lady, you missed a spot," he said, pointing to an area Maria had already cleaned. "Maybe you should get some glasses. Old age catching up with you?" Maria bit back the response that rose in her throat. She wanted to tell him that her eyes were sharp enough to spot an enemy sniper at 300 yards, sharp enough to find a vein in a wounded soldier's arm during a sandstorm, sharp enough to read the gratitude in the faces of men she had pulled back from the edge of death. Instead, she simply moved to the area he had indicated and began cleaning it again, her movements patient and thorough. "This is pathetic," muttered Technical Sergeant Brooks, shaking his head in disgust. "They're paying this woman to waste our time and theirs. She should be cleaning bathrooms, not touching our aircraft." "Maybe she's confused," suggested another voice from the crowd. "Maybe she thinks this is a bus or something she can just wipe down like she's back in Mexico." The racist comment hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and for a moment even some of the other airmen looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke up to defend Maria, no one challenged the speaker, and the moment passed without consequence. Maria's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on her cleaning cloth, but her expression remained calm. She had heard variations of this comment throughout her life, from the day she first enlisted in the Army as an 18-year-old girl, trying to escape poverty in South Texas. She had proven her worth 1,000 times over, had earned the respect of commanders and soldiers who fought beside her, had saved lives regardless of the color of her skin or the accent in her voice. But here, in this moment, she was just the cleaning lady, and these young service members felt entitled to diminish her humanity for their entertainment. As she worked near the aircraft's cargo ramp, Maria noticed something that made her pause. There, barely visible beneath layers of paint and wear, was a small emblem that most people would never notice. It was faded and weathered, but her trained eye recognized it immediately. Her heart began to beat faster as she gently cleaned around the marking, being careful not to damage what remained of the paint. The emblem was from the 4th Infantry Division, the same unit she had served with during Desert Storm. More specifically, It was the symbol of the 1st Battalion, 4th Medical Regiment, her old unit. This aircraft, or at least parts of it, had a connection to her past, to the place where Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had earned her reputation as one of the finest combat medics in the Army. She continued cleaning around the Emblem, her movements becoming even more careful and reverent. The airmen behind her continued their commentary, unaware that they were mocking a veteran who had likely seen more combat than all of them combined. "Look at her go," someone commented. "She's really getting into it now. Must be thinking about her paycheck. Or maybe she's practicing for when she gets to clean the general's car," another voice added, sparking fresh laughter. Maria ignored them all, her focus entirely on the faded Emblem before her. Memories flooded back of the men and women she had served with, the missions they had flown, the lives that had been saved because of aircraft like this one. She remembered the day they had loaded wounded soldiers onto a similar gunship. How grateful she had been for the protection it provided as they evacuated casualties under enemy fire. Her cleaning cloth moved with even greater purpose now, not just cleaning but honoring, not just maintaining but remembering. She was no longer just a contractor doing her job. She was a veteran paying respect to the machine that had helped her save lives. That had been part of her story long before any of these young airmen had even considered military service. The crowd behind her was growing restless, their initial amusement beginning to fade as Maria's quiet dignity failed to provide the reaction they had hoped for. Some began to drift away, but the core group remained, determined to get some kind of response from the woman who refused to be broken by their words. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the tarmac when Captain Rodriguez approached from the direction of the operations building. Unlike the junior enlisted personnel who had been entertaining themselves at Maria's expense, Captain Rodriguez carried himself with the bearing of someone who had seen real combat. His flight suit bore the patches of multiple deployments, and his eyes held the kind of weariness that came from too many missions in hostile territory. He had been heading to his office to complete post-flight paperwork when the commotion near his aircraft caught his attention. As the pilot of this particular AC-130, he felt a personal connection to the gunship that had carried him and his crew through 18 months of combat operations in Afghanistan. "What's going on here?" Captain Rodriguez asked as he approached the group, his voice carrying just enough authority to make the junior airman straighten up slightly. Staff Sergeant Williams quickly stepped forward, eager to explain the situation to an officer. "Sir, we were just watching the cleaning contractor work on your aircraft. Some of the guys were having a little fun, you know how it is." Captain Rodriguez's expression remained neutral, but his eyes took in the scene before him. An older Hispanic woman was methodically cleaning his aircraft, while a group of airmen stood around making comments. He had seen similar situations before, and they always left him feeling uncomfortable about the military culture he was supposed to represent. "Having fun?" he repeated, his tone suggesting that he might not share their definition of entertainment. "Yes, sir," Airman Johnson chimed in, apparently missing the captain's disapproval. "We were just commenting on how interesting it is to watch someone clean a $30 million aircraft with household cleaning supplies." Captain Rodriguez walked closer to observe Maria's work, and what he saw surprised him. Her movements were not those of someone simply going through the motions of a job. She handled the aircraft with the kind of respect and knowledge that suggested familiarity with military equipment. Her technique was methodical and professional, more like a crew chief preparing for inspection than a civilian contractor performing routine maintenance. "She seems to know what she's doing," the captain observed, his comment causing some of the airmen to exchange glances. "With respect, sir," Technical Sergeant Brooks interjected. "She's just a cleaning lady." "I mean, how much can she really know about aircraft?" Captain Rodriguez continued watching Maria work, noting the care she took around sensitive equipment, the way she avoided areas that shouldn't be touched by unauthorized personnel, the respect she showed for the aircraft's weapon systems. This wasn't the behavior of someone who didn't understand what she was working on. As he moved closer to get a better view of her work, something caught his eye that made him stop in his tracks. Near the cargo ramp, barely visible beneath years of paint and wear, was a faded military emblem. It was so worn that most people would never notice it, but Captain Rodriguez had trained himself to observe details that others missed. The emblem was from the 4th Infantry Division, 1st Battalion, 4th Medical Regiment. Rodriguez recognized it because his father had served with that unit during Desert Storm, and he had grown up hearing stories about the combat medics who had saved countless lives during that conflict. He watched as Maria carefully cleaned around the emblem, her movements becoming even more gentle and precise when she reached that particular area. There was something almost reverent in the way she handled that section of the aircraft, as if it held special meaning for her. "Ma'am," Captain Rodriguez called out, his voice respectful rather than commanding. Maria looked up from her work, her eyes meeting his with quiet dignity. She had learned to read military officers over the years, and this one seemed different from the young airman who had been mocking her. There was something in his expression that suggested experience and wisdom rather than arrogance and prejudice. "Yes, sir," she replied, setting down her cleaning cloth and standing straighter. "I noticed you're being very careful around that emblem there," he said, pointing to the faded marking. "Do you know what it represents?" The airman who had been watching fell silent, curious about this unexpected turn in the conversation. Some of them looked confused, unable to see what the captain was referring to. Maria glanced down at the emblem, then back at Captain Rodriguez. For a moment she seemed to be weighing her words, deciding how much to reveal. "Yes, sir. I know what it is. Would you mind telling me?" the captain asked, his tone gentle and encouraging. Maria took a deep breath, and for the first time since the mockery had begun, she allowed a hint of pride to enter her voice. "It's the emblem of the 1st Battalion, 4th Medical Regiment, 4th Infantry Division. They served in Desert Storm." The specificity of her answer surprised Captain Rodriguez. This wasn't the kind of knowledge that someone would have unless they had a personal connection to that unit. "That's very specific," he noted. "How do you know so much about it?" The airmen around them were now paying close attention, their earlier amusement replaced by curiosity. Even Staff Sergeant Williams looked interested, though she still seemed skeptical that the cleaning lady could have any meaningful military knowledge. Maria hesitated for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "I served with that unit, sir. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, Combat Medic, 1st Battalion, 4th Medical Regiment." The silence that followed her words was profound. The airmen who had been mocking her just minutes earlier now stared in shock, their assumptions shattered by this simple revelation. Captain Rodriguez felt a surge of respect and embarrassment. Here was a veteran, someone who had served her country in combat, being ridiculed by service members who had likely never seen the kind of action she had experienced. "Staff Sergeant Santos," he said, his voice now carrying a tone of respect that made several of the watching airmen shift uncomfortably. "What was your specialty?" "Combat medic, sir. I served 2 deployments in Desert Storm, primarily with helicopter and fixed-wing evacuation units." Captain Rodriguez nodded slowly, processing this information. He looked around at the group of airmen who had been entertaining themselves at her expense, and he could see the shame beginning to dawn on their faces. The woman they had been calling an old cleaning lady was a combat veteran, someone who had risked her life to save others, someone who had earned the right to wear the uniform they now wore. She had served in combat while some of them were still children, had proven her worth under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. "How long did you serve?" Captain Rodriguez asked. 12 years active duty, sir. I was medically retired after taking shrapnel in a mortar attack while treating wounded soldiers." The captain's respect for Maria deepened with each revelation. Medical retirement usually meant significant injury, the kind that ended careers and changed lives forever. Captain Rodriguez's mind raced as he processed what Maria had just revealed. A combat medic with 12 years of service, medically retired due to injuries sustained while treating wounded soldiers. This changed everything about the situation he had walked into. "Staff Sergeant Santos," he said, his voice now carrying the formal respect due to a fellow veteran. "Would you mind if I asked about your decorations?" Maria's weathered hand smoothed down her work uniform as she considered his question. She had spent so many years trying to blend into the background, trying not to draw attention to herself, that talking about her military service felt strange and uncomfortable. "I received the Bronze Star for actions during a helicopter evacuation under enemy fire," she said quietly. "Also the Purple Heart for injuries sustained during a mortar attack on our forward aid station." The silence that followed was deafening. The Bronze Star was awarded for heroic or meritorious achievement in a combat zone, one of the highest honors a soldier could receive. The Purple Heart meant she had shed blood for her country, had been wounded while serving others. Airman Johnson, who had been one of the most vocal in his mockery, now looked like he wanted to disappear into the tarmac. His face had gone pale, and his eyes couldn't meet Maria's steady gaze. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had questioned Maria's competence just minutes earlier, now found herself unable to speak. The woman she had dismissed as just a cleaning lady had decorations that Williams could only dream of earning. Captain Rodriguez felt a mixture of admiration and anger. Admiration for the veteran standing before him, and anger at the situation that had allowed her to be treated with such disrespect. "Staff Sergeant Santos," he said, "would you mind telling us about the Bronze Star? What did you do to earn it?" Maria glanced around at the faces surrounding her, seeing shock, shame, and newfound respect in their expressions. These young service members needed to understand what real courage looked like, what real service meant. "We were evacuating wounded soldiers from a landing zone that came under heavy enemy fire," she began, her voice steady despite the painful memories. "The helicopter took multiple hits, and we had several critically wounded patients on board. The crew chief was hit, and I had to take over his duties while continuing to treat the wounded." She paused, remembering the chaos of that day, the sound of bullets hitting the aircraft's hull, the screams of wounded soldiers, the smell of blood and smoke that had filled the helicopter's cabin. The pilot was struggling to maintain control, and we were losing altitude rapidly. I had to make a decision between securing myself for a potential crash landing or continuing to work on a soldier who was bleeding out. I chose to keep working. Captain Rodriguez listened intently, recognizing the kind of split-second decision that separated heroes from ordinary people. "What happened next?" "We managed to land safely at a forward surgical hospital, but it was close. The soldier I was treating survived because of the care he received during those critical minutes in the air. 2 others also survived because I was able to stabilize them during the flight." Technical Sergeant Brooks, who had earlier suggested that Maria was confused about the aircraft's purpose, now understood that she probably knew more about medical evacuations than anyone else on the base. "The Purple Heart," Captain Rodriguez continued gently. "How did that happen?" Maria's hand unconsciously moved to her left shoulder, where shrapnel still remained buried too deep for safe surgical removal. 3 weeks after the helicopter incident, our forward aid station was hit by mortar fire. I was treating 4 wounded soldiers when the attack began. Instead of seeking cover, I continued working on my patients. Her voice remained steady, but Captain Rodriguez could see the pain in her eyes as she relived the memory. A mortar round landed close enough to send shrapnel through the tent wall. I was hit in the shoulder and back, but I finished treating the soldiers before I allowed anyone to treat my wounds. All 4 patients survived. The young airmen around her were now completely silent, absorbing the reality of what they had been witness to. This woman had literally taken shrapnel while saving the lives of other soldiers, had put her patients' welfare above her own safety without hesitation. Airman Rodriguez, who shared Maria's surname but had never served in combat, felt ashamed of his earlier comments about her age and ethnicity. Here was someone who embodied the very best of military service, someone who had proved her courage and dedication under the most extreme circumstances. "After the mortar attack," Maria continued, "the shrapnel damage to my shoulder was too severe for me to continue serving as a medic. The repetitive motions required for patient care caused too much pain and limited my effectiveness. The Army Medical Board determined that I should be medically retired." Captain Rodriguez nodded with understanding. Medical retirement was often heartbreaking for career soldiers, especially those who loved their work as much as Maria clearly had. "What did you do after retirement?" he asked. "I tried civilian healthcare for a while," Maria replied, "but the physical limitations made it difficult. I needed work that would allow me to stay connected to the military somehow, to continue serving in whatever way I could. When this job became available, cleaning and maintaining military aircraft, it felt like a way to keep serving." The revelation hit the watching airmen like a physical blow. The woman they had been mocking wasn't just doing a job for a paycheck. She was continuing her service to the military community in the only way her injuries would allow. Every aircraft she cleaned was an act of dedication to the institution that had defined her adult life. Staff Sergeant Williams found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology, we all do. I had no idea." "You had no way of knowing," Maria replied with characteristic grace. "I don't talk about my service very often. Most people see what they expect to see. Captain Rodriguez looked around at his airmen, seeing the shame and newfound respect in their faces. This was a teaching moment that would stay with them for the rest of their careers. "Staff Sergeant Santos," he said formally, "on behalf of the United States Air Force and this unit specifically, I want to thank you for your service and apologize for the treatment you received today. You deserve far better than what happened here." Maria nodded acknowledgement of his words, but she could see that he wasn't finished speaking. Word of what had happened on the tarmac spread through Peterson Air Force Base like wildfire. By the next morning, the story of Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had reached every corner of the installation, from the enlisted barracks to the command offices. The tale grew with each telling, but the core message remained the same: never judge someone by their appearance or current circumstances. Captain Rodriguez had been true to his word. First thing Tuesday morning, he had marched into Colonel Patricia Hayes's office with a formal recommendation for recognition of Maria's service. The base commander, a sharp woman with 25 years of military experience, listened intently as Rodriguez described both Maria's military record and the incident that had brought it to light. "So you're telling me," Colonel Hayes said after hearing the full story, "that we have a Bronze Star and Purple Heart recipient cleaning our aircraft, and she's been doing it for 15 years without anyone knowing her background?" "Yes, ma'am," Captain Rodriguez confirmed. "She's been essentially invisible to most of us, just another contractor doing her job. But after seeing how she handled that aircraft, how she knew exactly what she was doing, I started asking questions." Colonel Hayes leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. "And your airmen had been mocking her before you discovered who she was?" "Unfortunately, yes, ma'am. It was a sobering lesson for all of us about the assumptions we make about people." The colonel nodded thoughtfully. She had seen similar situations throughout her career, where veterans found themselves in civilian roles that didn't reflect their true capabilities or experience. The transition from military to civilian life was often difficult, especially for those with service-connected injuries. "I want to meet with Staff Sergeant Santos," she decided, "and I want to review her personnel file and military records. If she's half the soldier you describe, we need to find a better way to utilize her skills and experience." Meanwhile, Maria arrived at work that morning to find a small group of airmen waiting for her near the equipment shed. Instead of the mockery she had endured the day before, she was greeted with respectful nods and offers to help carry her supplies. Airman Johnson approached her first, his expression serious and contrite. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about what happened yesterday all night. I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to teach me about aircraft maintenance from a medic's perspective. I know that sounds strange, but I realize I don't really understand how all the systems work together." Maria was touched by his genuine interest. "Of course, Airman Johnson. I'd be happy to share what I know." Staff Sergeant Williams joined them, carrying a thermos of coffee. "I brought you some coffee, ma'am. I thought you might like some before we start work today." The gesture was small but significant, a peace offering that acknowledged the respect Maria deserved. As they walked toward the flight line together, Williams continued, "I also wanted to ask about your medical training. I'm considering cross-training into medical services, and I'd value your perspective on what that career field is really like." Throughout the morning, more personnel stopped by to introduce themselves to Maria. Some were genuinely curious about her military experience. Others simply wanted to show respect to a veteran they had previously overlooked. The transformation in her daily routine was remarkable. Technical Sergeant Brooks had taken it upon himself to research Maria's unit history, and he approached her during lunch break with a folder full of information about the 1st Battalion. "4th Medical Regiment, ma'am," he said. "I spent some time last night learning about your old unit. I had no idea about the role combat medics played in Desert Storm. The casualty survival rates during that conflict were unprecedented, largely because of medics like you." Maria accepted the folder with interest, surprised to see that someone had taken the time to research her service history. Inside were copies of unit citations, historical accounts of medical operations during the Gulf War, and even some photographs of aircraft similar to the ones she had worked on during her active duty service. "This brings back a lot of memories," she said softly, studying a photograph of a medical evacuation helicopter. "We saved a lot of lives with these aircraft." "That's exactly why what you do now is so important," Brooks replied. "You understand what these machines mean to the people who depend on them." When you clean and maintain them, you're not just doing a job. You're ensuring they're ready to save lives, just like they did when you were serving. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Hayes's aide, who approached Maria with a formal request for her to report to the base commander's office at 1400 hours. Maria felt a flutter of anxiety. In her experience, being called to the commander's office usually meant trouble, and she wondered if the previous day's incident had somehow reflected poorly on her performance. "Don't worry, ma'am," Captain Rodriguez assured her when he heard about the summons. "I spoke with the colonel this morning. This is a good thing, I promise." At exactly 1400 hours, Maria found herself standing at attention in Colonel Hayes's office, wearing her best civilian clothes and feeling nervous about what was to come. At ease. "Staff Sergeant Santos," the colonel said, gesturing for Maria to take a seat. "I've been hearing some interesting stories about your background." "Yes, ma'am," Maria replied carefully, unsure how much the colonel knew. Colonel Hayes opened a thick folder on her desk. "I've spent the morning reviewing your military records and speaking with Captain Rodriguez about yesterday's incident. I have to say I'm impressed by both your service record and the way you handled a difficult situation." Maria remained silent, waiting to see where the conversation was heading. "I'm also somewhat embarrassed," the colonel continued, "that we've had a decorated combat veteran working on our base for 15 years, without anyone in the command structure knowing about your background. That's a failure on our part, and I want to correct it." The colonel stood and walked around her desk to face Maria directly. "Staff Sergeant Santos, I'm hereby offering you a position as a civilian instructor in our medical training program. Your experience and knowledge are too valuable to waste on routine maintenance tasks." Maria was stunned. She had expected criticism or questions about the previous day's incident, not a job offer that would return her to medical training. "Ma'am, I'm honored by the offer," she managed, "but I'm not sure I'm qualified for instructional duties anymore. My injuries limit my physical capabilities." "Your physical limitations don't diminish your knowledge or experience," Colonel Hayes replied firmly. "We need someone who can teach our young medics what real combat medicine looks like, someone who's been there and understands the realities they might face. Your injuries aren't a disqualification. They're proof of your credibility." Captain Rodriguez took a step back and, to the amazement of everyone present, came to attention and rendered a sharp military salute to Maria. The gesture was so unexpected, so powerful in its symbolism, that several of the watching airmen gasped audibly. "Staff Sergeant Santos," he said in a voice that carried across the tarmac, "thank you for your service to our nation and your sacrifice for your fellow soldiers." Maria stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the unexpected honor being shown to her. It had been years since anyone had saluted her, years since her military service had been recognized in such a formal way. Slowly, she straightened her shoulders and returned the salute with the precision of a career soldier, her movements sharp despite her age and injuries. The sight of this exchange sent shockwaves through the group of airmen. Here was their pilot, a decorated combat veteran himself, showing the highest form of military respect to the woman they had been ridiculing just minutes before. One by one, as if moved by the same impulse, the other service members began to come to attention. First Technical Sergeant Brooks, shame evident on his face as he rendered his salute. Then Staff Sergeant Williams, her earlier arrogance replaced by genuine respect. Airman Johnson followed, his hands trembling slightly as he realized the magnitude of his earlier disrespect. Soon, every airman on the tarmac was standing at attention, saluting the woman they had dismissed as just a cleaning lady. The transformation was remarkable and moving, a moment of recognition that transcended rank and circumstance. Maria held her salute until Captain Rodriguez dropped his, then slowly lowered her hand. Tears had formed in her eyes, but her expression remained dignified and composed. This moment of respect meant more to her than any of them could possibly understand. "At ease," Captain Rodriguez commanded, and the group relaxed their formal postures, though the atmosphere remained charged with emotion and newfound understanding. "I think," the captain continued, addressing his airmen, "that we all learned something important today about making assumptions about people based on their appearance or job title. Staff Sergeant Santos has served this nation with distinction and honor, and she continues to serve by maintaining the aircraft that protect our service members in combat." He turned back to Maria, his expression serious and respectful. "Ma'am, I hope you'll accept our apologies for what happened here today. The behavior you witnessed is not representative of the values we're supposed to uphold. Maria nodded graciously. Captain, these young people are learning, just as I had to learn when I was their age. What matters is that they grow from this experience and remember to look beyond the surface when they encounter others. Her words were generous, more forgiving than anyone had a right to expect given the treatment she had endured. Airman Johnson stepped forward, his voice shaking with emotion. Ma'am, I want to personally apologize for my comments about your age and your abilities. I was completely wrong and I'm ashamed of my behavior. Staff Sergeant Williams followed suit, her military bearing now tempered with humility. Staff Sergeant Santos, I questioned your competence and knowledge and I was completely out of line. You've forgotten more about military service than I'll probably ever know. One by one, each of the airmen who had participated in the mockery stepped forward to offer personal apologies. Some struggled to find words adequate to express their shame and newfound respect. Others simply stood at attention and apologized formally, letting their military bearing speak for them. Maria accepted each apology with grace and dignity, offering words of encouragement to the young service members who were clearly struggling with the realization of what they had done. Captain Rodriguez watched this process with satisfaction, knowing that his airmen were learning a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their careers. The military was supposed to be a meritocracy, a place where service and sacrifice were honored regardless of rank or background. Staff Sergeant Santos, he said when the apologies were complete, I'd like to ask you something. Would you be willing to speak to our unit about your experiences? I think our airmen could benefit from hearing about your service, about what combat medicine was like during Desert Storm. Maria considered his request carefully. She had spent so many years trying to remain invisible, trying not to draw attention to herself or her past. But these young people needed to understand what service really meant, needed to hear from someone who had lived it. I would be honored, Captain, she replied, if you think it would be helpful. I know it would be, he assured her. Too many of our young airmen have never heard first-hand accounts of combat service. They need to understand the legacy they're inheriting, the standards set by veterans like yourself. Technical Sergeant Brooks stepped forward, his expression earnest. Ma'am, I'd also like to ask if you'd be willing to let us help you with the aircraft cleaning. Not because you need help, but because we'd be honored to work alongside you. The offer surprised Maria, but she could see the sincerity in his eyes. These young people wanted to make amends, wanted to show their respect through action rather than just words. That's very kind of you, Sergeant Brooks, she replied. I would welcome the company. Captain Rodriguez smiled at this exchange, seeing the beginning of what could become a meaningful relationship between the veteran and his airmen. There's one more thing, he said, his tone becoming more formal. Staff Sergeant Santos, I'm going to speak with the base commander about recognizing your continued service to this installation. 15 years of dedicated work, combined with your military record, deserves official recognition. Maria felt overwhelmed by the captain's kindness, but she managed to maintain her composure. That's very generous, Captain, but not necessary. I'm just doing my job. No, ma'am, he replied firmly. You're doing much more than that. You're continuing to serve, and that service should be acknowledged. As the group began to disperse, with the airmen returning to their duties chastened but enlightened, Captain Rodriguez remained with Maria to finish their conversation. Staff Sergeant Santos, he said quietly, I want you to know that what happened here today will not happen again. I'm going to make sure my airmen understand the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their position or appearance. Maria nodded her appreciation, then returned to her cleaning supplies. But the atmosphere had completely changed. Instead of working alone while being mocked, she now had several young airmen asking if they could assist her, eager to learn from her experience and show their respect through action. 6 months later, Maria Santos stood before a classroom filled with young Air Force medics, her instructor's badge gleaming on her civilian uniform. The transformation in her life had been remarkable, but perhaps more important was the transformation in the culture of Peterson Air Force Base. The story of what had happened on the tarmac that day had become legendary among the base personnel. It was told to every new arrival, shared in leadership training courses, and used as an example of why respect and dignity should be extended to everyone, regardless of their position or appearance. Maria's new role as a medical instructor had proven to be exactly what both she and the Air Force needed. Her classes were always full, with students eager to learn from someone who had actually lived the experiences she taught about. Her lectures on combat medicine were riveting, filled with real-world examples and hard-earned wisdom that no textbook could provide. "The thing you have to understand," she told her current class of 25 students, "is that in combat, you don't have the luxury of perfect conditions. You'll be treating patients in helicopters that are taking enemy fire, in field hospitals under mortar attack, in situations where your own life is at risk. The technical skills are important, but mental toughness and adaptability are what will save lives." The students hung on her every word, knowing they were learning from someone who had earned her credentials through blood and sacrifice, rather than just study and theory. After class, several students approached with questions, a common occurrence that Maria never tired of. Teaching had rekindled her passion for military medicine in a way she hadn't expected. As she gathered her materials, Captain Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. He had become a regular visitor to her classes, partly to observe training but mostly because he enjoyed seeing Maria in her element. "Outstanding class as always, Staff Sergeant Santos," he said with a smile. "I could listen to your stories all day." "Thank you, Captain. These students remind me why I loved being a medic. Their enthusiasm is infectious." Rodriguez nodded, then his expression became more serious. "I wanted to let you know that the base commander has nominated you for the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service. It's recognition for your years of dedication both as a contractor and now as an instructor." Maria felt overwhelmed by the honor. The Secretary of Defense Medal was one of the highest civilian awards the Department of Defense could bestow. "I don't know what to say," she managed. "That's incredibly generous." "It's incredibly deserved," Rodriguez replied. "You've impacted the lives of hundreds of service members, both through your cleaning work and your teaching. The nomination specifically mentions how your example has changed the culture of this base, regarding respect for all personnel." As they walked together toward the parking lot, Maria reflected on how much her life had changed since that day 6 months ago. The job change had been wonderful, but the real transformation had been in how she was seen and treated by the military community she had served for so long. The airmen who had once mocked her now greeted her with genuine respect and warmth. Many had become regular visitors to her classes, eager to learn from her experience. Some had even formed lasting mentoring relationships with her, seeking her advice on military careers and life decisions. Staff Sergeant Williams had indeed cross-trained into medical services and was now one of Maria's best students. The young woman who had once questioned Maria's competence now hung on, her every word during training sessions. Airman Johnson had been so inspired by Maria's example that he had applied for officer candidate school, with dreams of becoming a flight surgeon. He credited their conversations about service and sacrifice with helping him find direction in his military. Career Technical Sergeant Brooks had taken it upon himself to research other base personnel who might have hidden backgrounds or unrecognized talents. His efforts had uncovered several veterans working in civilian roles, who were now being utilized more effectively based on their experience and skills, but perhaps the most significant change was in the overall culture of the base. The story of Maria's revelation had sparked base-wide discussions about respect, dignity, and the danger of making assumptions about people based on their appearance or current circumstances. Colonel Hayes had implemented new orientation programs for all personnel, emphasizing the diverse backgrounds and experiences of the people who made the base function. The message was clear. Everyone deserved respect. Everyone had value, and everyone might have a story worth knowing. As Maria reached her car, she found a small group of her students waiting for her. They had been discussing the day's lesson and had additional questions about treating shock in combat conditions. "Ma'am," one of them said, "we were wondering if you'd be willing to share more stories about your time in Desert Storm. The real experiences you describe help us understand the material so much better than just reading about it." Maria smiled, remembering her own hunger for knowledge when she was their age. "Of course. Why don't you all come to my office tomorrow after lunch? I'll show you some photographs and documents from my deployments." As the students dispersed with excited thank yous, Maria felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what her military service had ultimately been about, preparing the next generation to serve with competence, courage, and compassion. The irony wasn't lost on her that the incident which had initially caused her pain and embarrassment had ultimately led to the most fulfilling period of her post-military life. The young airman who had mocked her had unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would impact thousands of future service members. As she drove home through the Colorado evening, Maria thought about the faded emblem on the AC-130 that had started it all. That small, barely visible marking had connected her past with her present, had served as the catalyst for recognition she had never sought but deeply appreciated. She still visited the aircraft occasionally, not to clean it, but to remember. Captain Rodriguez had told her she was welcome on the flight line anytime, and she sometimes brought her students there to show them the aircraft they might one day work on in combat situations. The AC-130 had been updated and repainted since that day, but Maria knew the emblem was still there, hidden beneath the new paint layers. It served as a reminder that everyone has a story, everyone has value, and sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected sources. When she reached her house, Maria found a letter waiting from one of her former students who was now deployed overseas. The young medic wrote about how Maria's teachings had helped him save a soldier's life during a rocket attack on his forward operating base. As she read the letter, Maria felt the same sense of purpose she had experienced decades earlier when she first put on the uniform. The methods had changed, the setting was different, but the mission remained the same: training and inspiring others to serve with honor and excellence. The cleaning lady who had been invisible for so many years was now one of the most respected and beloved figures on Peterson Air Force Base. Her story had become a legend, but more importantly, her example had become a standard that others aspired to meet. In the end, Maria Santos had proven that true service doesn't end with retirement, that dignity and worth aren't determined by job titles, and that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. Her journey from mockery to recognition had changed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who heard her story and learned from her example.